Hello and welcome to Media Monitor on SABC News Channel, and it's 9 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday, which means it's time for your favorite media monitoring program. I'm your host, Peter Ndoro. Thanks very much for joining us. Here's what you can look forward to on today's show. We're going to be touching on a topic we briefly discussed on the show last week, but we thought it was so important that we need to take another look at it, and that's sexism in the media industry and just how rife it is. We'll also be zooming in on the plight of the migrant crisis, as this past week marked World Refugee Day. Get this, there's 68 million people that are refugees around the world, and that's, if that was a country, that would be the 11th largest in the world. Now, what's inside the Sunday newspapers, we'll take a look at that as well, and we'll also take a look at those headlines. And lastly, a controversial website that claims to shed light on and expose South African news will be under the spotlight. And guess what? It's coming out of Thailand. Yeah, all of that still to come. But before we engage with our panel on all of that and more, let's take a look at the Sunday newspaper headlines. And we start with the Sunday Times, which is leading with a story about the VBS Mutual Bank in Limpopo. A helicopter for the vendor king, luxury sea-facing apartments and sports cars. These are glittering proceeds of what is shaping to be one of South Africa's costliest and most audacious bank heists. About 900 million rand is accounted for. That's almost R1 billion. At the center of this alleged looting is said to be the former VBS chairman, Chipiwa Matodzi, and Vele Investment Group CEO Robert Madzonga. Sunday Times further reveals that at least part of the VBS's largesse was sponsored by illegal deposits made by poor municipalities to the tune of about R1.5 billion. Scandal, scandal, scandal. Now, the City Press, that's leading with the same article as the Sunday Times on how VBS Mutual Bank's crash paralyzed municipalities after it lost R1.5 billion of their funds. Details are now emerging of how the Bavenda King, Tony Mpepu, Ramobalana and the bank's executives lived the high life. The Sunday Independent, well, that's running with a story about deeper divisions within the ruling party, and the ANC may find it difficult to forge unity amongst its warring structures, riven with factionalism. Well, yesterday the ANC's held its provincial conference in Limpopo. A legal battle raged in the High Court in Johannesburg over the status of the Provincial Executive Committee under Premier Stan Matabata, arguing that the PEC's term of office expired on February the 14th, Valentine's Day. Now, the Sunday Tribune is this morning carrying a story about the Indo-African race relations. Energy Minister Jeff Radebe joined several hundred people on a 15-kilometer social cohesion walk from Phoenix to KwaMashu yesterday, hoping to help bridge the growing divide between Indians and Africans. The We Are One walk echoed the One Nation, Many Cultures mantra that Nelson Mandela championed in the 1990s. Now, the annual walk took on greater significance in the wake of recent comments by EFF leader Julius Malema and his deputy Floyd Shivambu, who said that Indians undermined Africans in Treasury. Okay, the Weekend Argus, well, that leads with a story about how the National Health Insurance Policy is set to ring in tremendous change as Health Minister Aaron Motsoaledi and his team attempt to overcome the imprint of apartheid on the country's healthcare system. Crossing our borders into Swaziland, the Sunday Observer there is leading with a story about how outgoing Member of Parliament Jabulani Bycash Mabuza will contest the upcoming Swaziland elections. And in neighboring Lesotho, the Sunday Express there is leading with a story about how the Lesotho government has reinstated the slain Mavarankwe Mahau to his former position as commander of the Lesotho Defence Force and at the rank of Lieutenant General. All right, that's a look at some of your papers. We'll take a look inside and on the front of those in more detail a little bit later on. Right, let's talk about one of these topics which we don't talk about often enough and we need to talk more about. We touched on it last week, but we thought it was so important we needed to take another look at it, and that's sexism in the media industry, which remains a major problem in the media industry worldwide, and questions around the lack of attention that it receives. In the US, the hashtag #MeToo sparked a debate that shook the media industry to its core. Women shared their experiences of sexual harassment and even assault. Several actresses made allegations against, for example, Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein, and soon others followed in the movie industry and the music business, journalism and beyond. The results of the hashtag #MeToo saw high-placed men quitting their positions, and the hashtag quickly turned into a global movement that exposed the magnitude of this problem. Well, sisters working in the film and television industry, Swift, came up with a hashtag "That's Not Okay" to recognize sexual harassment in the workplace, and we're joined by Aliki Saragas from Swift to tell us a little bit more about the hashtag. But first, let's take a look at this story by way of background, courtesy of Swift.
Chef, Lily Mike, I really don't want her to feel uncomfortable. Shop.
It's your dala.
I am always serious. What's up?
Hayibo, i-topic yethu ikhuluma ngokuhlukunyezwa komuntu wesifazane. Asikwazi uku-interview uLulu Mthembu. Buka ama-Instagram post akhe, buka la. Ama-Instagram post akhe lawo. Hayibo, uyambona nje lo muntu wesifazane ukuthi akanankinga nokuhlafazwa indoda.
So ufuna ndithini? The other guests cancelled on us.
Hayi, kulungile choice yakho. Kodwa nje akekho uthatha lo muntu wesifazane serious.
Okay. Alisa, I don't fucking mic. The only males on sound today. Okay. Show time in 5 minutes, okay?
Okay, no problem. Your curves pop in this dress.
Of course, child. If Lulu don't pop, who do you think will?
Perfect. Let's go.
Okay, so that's a dramatization to give you an idea of the kinds of sexual harassment that's taking place. And to unpack this, I'm now joined from sisters working in film and television, Swift, Aliki Saragas. Thanks very much for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
And also another familiar face, Kate Skinner, Executive Director at the South African National Editors Forum. Thanks very much for joining us and welcome.
Great to be here.
All right, so that's took me a little bit by surprise, I must be honest with you, because when we're talking about sexism and sexual harassment, one has a certain image in one's mind of how it plays out. And you presented something quite different, but speaks very powerfully to this. Tell us about, why we need to talk about this. What does this tell us about what's going on in the industry? Let's start with you.
Sure. So, as Swift, we're an organization for women in the film and television industry, and we started about 2 years ago with the aims of mentorship and skills training, sisterhood cinema, which is about transformation of women's representation, both in front and behind the lens. But very quickly we realized that during our meetings and how many women were coming forward giving testimony of how they had been sexually harassed in the industry, we decided this was going to be our main focus. And that's where we drove all our attention. Initially, we've also realized that there's no research on sexual harassment in the South African film and television industry anywhere. So we embarked on creating research and data so as to back our interventions that we eventually would do, which is one of them is the hashtag That's Not Okay, that movement that you've referred to. So we embarked on doing this research, and we discovered through an anonymous survey that nearly 70% of women in our industry, both in front and behind the lens, experience or feel uncomfortable in the workplace due to unwanted sexual advances. And the most interesting thing that we found out is that it's not only about the gross human rights violations, the criminal offenses such as rape and assault, but it's also got to do with the microaggressions that permeate culture, really not only in our industry, but actually in multiple industries in our society. It's the idea that catcalling, on a set or in a workplace where you're supposed to be respected as a professional in your field, to be called baby or sweetie, to be touched inappropriately, where you're a professional and you're just trying to do what you want to do. So all of these kind of microaggressions in the research found that actually, because they are not being addressed, they form the basis of then more violent acts that happen later on.
So they escalate.
Exactly.
Kate, a journalist going through the same thing. You know, there was one story that made headlines not so long ago about a journalist, a young journalist who went to interview a prominent politician and was sexually assaulted or harassed. Is this something that journalists are facing as well?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, I think it's fantastic that these kind of things are coming out now, because before, it was something that you just sort of put up with. And I think it's very interesting to talk about kind of political journalists. But, they really did put up with an incredible amount of abuse in order to get the stories that they wanted. And it's certainly come up in SANEF, in the South African National Editors Forum, that sexual harassment is a massive issue. And actually, interestingly, it's getting worse, and and that's partly because of the whole social media issue. So, for instance, this week we were dealing with feral refugees, like incredibly ugly sort of response where somebody had basically said, it didn't feel like it was specifically about gender issues. It was about, the fact that she was Indian, and they were sort of saying, leave the country, this is not your country, we're going to put a bullet to your head. But what was interesting in terms of her very personal response around that was that we as women get more of that. Often we get that like deeply personal, where you get a direct message, and then the direct message comes saying, we'll put a bullet to your head, and I mean, your life is, you have a sense that your life is under threat, and so those are the kinds of things we're seeing. So cyberbullying, sexual harassment, and it's something that actually SANEF has now decided that we're going to take up.
So Aliki, I was speaking to some makeup artists, and they tell me that politicians and CEOs of companies are among the worst at this. Do you think it is a power thing, that they feel that they can just extend this power to young, innocent girls?
I think definitely that has to do with it. I think especially when you enter the industry as a young woman, unsure of where you stand, and you have powerful figures who kind of exert that power over you, I think that's definitely probably one of the main sources of sexual harassment. In terms of also on the web, it's one of the microaggressions. Getting direct messages, inappropriate direct messages, is just one of them. But what was also interesting in the research that we conducted was even women who are at very, very high positions of power, even CEOs of companies, also experience this. It was almost as if sometimes your position doesn't actually protect you. So whereas I think it's most prevalent with women coming into the industry, and perhaps makeup artists, like you mentioned, kind of behind the scenes, it happens more prevalent, but it really does, though, permeate throughout. And I think that is something that we need to see. And that's just one of our PSAs from the hashtag That's Not Okay campaign. We've got 7 more that shows, and I think this one's particularly interesting because it it also shows that it's also not only gendered, it's not only men to women. Even though that is predominantly what happens in our society, it really permeates, and it's something that we need to be discussing.
Sexism takes all sorts of forms, and it might be harassment, but it's also kind of positions and jobs that are available to women, and ageism as well, you know, where a woman gets a certain age, suddenly they're pulled off camera much quicker. I just wonder, in the media, the struggle for the woman journalist. Tell us a little bit about what you've been seeing.
So I mean, I think what's been really fascinating is this international conference, WAN-IFRA, the World Association of Newspapers, and they had a huge conference, and in fact one of their particular aims was to ensure that, you know, women in news were given that prominence. So as you say, you know, somebody, you know, to be taken seriously because you are like right at the cutting edge of kind of news. And then what happened at one of their main events was that the head of the Portuguese Association of kind of Press Association basically was talking about, I'm Charlie and these are my angels, and he was taking like the main kind of conference organizers there, like really powerful, really important women, and kind of talking about them, you know, as if they were kind of his sort of, you know, kind of almost servants or kind of there for his particular needs. It was absolutely atrocious. And then he basically said, well, actually it's a cultural thing, and that's another interesting thing that comes out. He was saying, well, in Portuguese culture, you know, the fact that I'm saying these kind of things, it's just funny and it's nice, and then he tried to kiss somebody inappropriately, and he was like, but I'm just being friendly. And the thing which was interesting is that they then interviewed some of the Portuguese journalists, and they said, well, you know, he's saying that this is just part of Portuguese culture, and they were like, it is very offensive. And what has happened is that, in fact, there's been an amazing like upsurge of like activism around it. And in fact, I was part of a webinar where we were talking about sexual harassment issues, and there were people from all over the world who were talking about these issues. And so actually that kind of really crazy, like very blatant thing has actually meant that a lot of women have said, you know what, we have got to take this seriously, and we've got to look at it on all fronts. You know, and what I like was what you were saying, behind the camera and in front, like, you know, in the industry, who's there, but what are the images that we are also portraying. And so I think there's a huge kind of campaign that has now come out of that conference, and it's an international campaign, and actually that's a positive thing, I think.
Aliki, an interesting thing that's come out of in Europe at the moment, I can't remember which country it is, but what they've decided is that any movie with sexual assault is going to get an 18 rating. Before, it had to be gratuitous violence and so on and so forth, and often rape scenes, just 16 was enough. Do you think that we need to think about that, even that you know, we need to put it such at a high level of restriction to make it serious?
I do. I think you know, in our industry, we hold a very specific and a very important culture creating space. What we show on television, how we write it, who's writing it, play a big part in how we create culture. And I think that by taking these kind of matters seriously, and by taking sexual assault seriously, and by increasing, if it means increasing you know, age restrictions, also just the way that sexual assault is represented in media is so important. And that's why I think that companies and production companies themselves need to be taking sexual harassment seriously. I mean, Swift has a code of conduct that we've developed that we urge every company to take on and to sign, because that means that you're taking it seriously and it's not just becoming a flippant issue. All
right, I'm running out of time, but I want to ask you, you speak up and then you never get work again in the industry. How do we counter that?
That's a huge problem. I think that it is, I mean, it's a very, very difficult one, because you are, it's such a risk to speak out, especially a risk to speak out on social media, because then you can be, you know, you get a defamation suit against you, for example. But if you have an entire group of women speaking out, then you have a movement. And that's what we're trying to create with That's Not Okay, is to show that you're not alone, that so many people are feeling the same way that you're feeling, crossing industries, crossing society, and we're stronger when we're together. And hopefully that creates a culture change so that when someone does speak out, they're not blacklisted in the industry and they can't get work again.
All right, so I'm being told to wrap this section up, but one important question I'd like to ask, and it's just how women are described. I'm seeing a lot of politicians talking about how beautiful women are, as if it's something that should be raised and complimented. We never say how handsome a man is. And I just wonder, as women, should we stop this and stop people saying things? If you've
it's so interesting because I mean, it was just something that I was realizing, you know, kind of raising daughters, and they were saying, you know, one of the most important things when you're raising your daughter is not to always comment about, oh my gosh, you look so beautiful today. It's like, my darling, what did you think about this particular thing? What did you think about this particular person? And to kind of, you know, actually look at the kind of more emotional, intelligent, intellectual kind of side of things, but not to be only focusing on that. Of course, it's wonderful to be told that you're beautiful, you know, but it's such an overemphasis. And I think that that's also the interesting thing about literally raising girls and saying, you know, how do you respond to a little girl? How do you respond to a little boy? Often the boy is about, what did you do at school? And what did you do here? And what are your activities? Whereas a girl is more that passive of like, oh my gosh, that dress is pretty. It's kind of like, can we move a little bit forward? I don't know whether, you know, you'd agree.
Yeah, and I think just to add on to that, I think it also depends on context and where you are. I think like if you're in a social environment and someone compliments you, that's fine. But if you're supposed to be doing work and in a professional space,
a presentation on a business thing,
it's
got nothing to do with it.
It's got nothing to do with it.
All right, I do have to wrap up this section, but I think something that we need to keep in the mind's eye constantly. We'll take a quick break. When we come back, more for you on Media Monitor.
A message from the Association for Alcohol Responsibility and Education, aware.org.
SABC News celebrates Youth Month.
Hello and welcome back. You're still watching Media Monitor. Now, if you were paying attention, you would have noticed that on Wednesday, June the 20th, the world marked World Refugee Day, a day that the United Nations created to celebrate and to mark the resilience and courage of refugees and their contributions to society in an effort to highlight the inhumane conditions that many migrants often have to face. La Repubblica journalist Alessandro Puglia exposed how a refugee center in Italy was flouting the most basic rights of migrants. The story, which included interviews with migrants describing how they were treated like animals, is being prosecuted for defamation and has been insulted and threatened on social networks. Let's take a look.
We're now at 68.5 million people displaced or refugees globally. Needless to say, this is because of protracted conflicts, lack of solutions for those conflicts that continue, continuous pressure on civilians in countries of conflict that push them to leave their homes, and new or aggravating crises as well. We observe that 85% of that 68.5 million is in poor or middle-income countries. That's a very significant element, I think, because it should be an element dispelling the perception, the notion that is so prevailing in many countries that the refugee crisis, singular, is a crisis of the rich world. It is not. It continues to be a crisis mostly of the poor world.
All right, so those interesting statistics are being raised there by the UN. Kate, let me start with you. I don't think a lot of people knew it was World Refugee Day. And is that our fault as media and as journalists? And also there's this misconception that everyone's running to Europe, whereas actually countries like Uganda carry the most refugees. And I believe as many as 80% of the refugees in the world are in developing nations. So whose fault is that we don't understand this problem properly?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite a difficult issue to unpack. And I mean, I think one of these are the kind of more complex ones. You know, sometimes media isn't as good as it should be in terms of covering the issues. And you're right. I mean, what happened when, you know, at SANEF on World Refugee Day, the Deputy Minister of Home Affairs phoned and said, please, can you make sure that all the editors come to this press conference because we don't feel that we're getting enough coverage on this, and specifically on the issue of the fact that it is a massive developing world problem, and in fact a massive Africa problem in terms of South Sudan. I mean, all these different conflict zones obviously create, you know, a huge amount of refugees. So I think that her panic kind of gave me a sense of the fact that, you know, please, can people cover this more? I think it's generally these kind of serious topics that are tricky to cover. And so my sense is that we've just got to be kind of cleverer in terms of, I mean, maybe it's infographics, maybe it's some of the human stories, it's those kinds of things. But also it's interesting, it's always this kind of one day, it's Refugee Day, you know, and then there's a sense of like, okay, well now we can kind of forget about it. And so my sense is that you know, you need multiple stories, in-depth things. The stats I think are really important, but then it's also the human interest stories. And those are the kinds of things that, you know, as a media, we need to be covering, but we need to be covering in ways that people can actually digest them. And that is fairly tricky.
All right, well, perhaps filmmakers can tell these stories in a different way that people can digest. Do you think that we're telling these stories enough, or should we be telling them? Your thoughts as a filmmaker?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because what documentary film, which is my area, what it does is it kind of takes the statistics and what you read in like black and white print and really makes it visual for people to empathize, because you bring up the human interest stories, you bring up the human beings behind the statistics. And at the moment there are it is quite a trend at the moment in the documentary film world to be doing refugee stories. I watched a brilliant film called 69 Minutes in 86 Days, which is a film about from the perspective of a little girl and how she travels throughout Europe with her family as a refugee. And it from the perspective of her and from the visuals, you really feel what they feel as they go through the journey. So very, very interesting. I haven't seen many on documentaries made about the refugee crisis in Africa, though, which is something that I think a focus can be put on.
And you know, I look at some of the images that we're showing now of people in refugee camps, and these look like South Sudanese. We have a lot of refugees in South Africa, and to really praise South Africa, we don't have camps here. That people are integrated in society in the most humane way, and I guess this is the kind of thing that we need to tell the story of a little bit more, that there are ways of handling refugees, and most refugees would rather be at home but can't be for some reason or the other.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I mean, I think it's to basically explain. I think, as you're saying, that I mean, the developing world issue, that we take in all of these refugees, which we've spoken about. But also, I think that you're right, that South Africa has done a lot of work on this area, and I thought that was very interesting. You know, the Deputy Minister basically saying, I do think that we knew, you know, where we have done a lot of work, we actually do need to be congratulated, and that's important. But there was also something that very interesting that came up with the Chief Justice last night, and we'll talk about it.
I want to talk about that. We're going to talk about that after the break, so
Great.
hold that thought. I really want to explore that, because I'll get excited about awards for journalists.
I'll hold that thought. But he was talking about xenophobia as being one of the things that is one of the absolute scourges across the world. And when you talk about xenophobia, obviously the refugee issues are absolutely front of mind. And I thought it was so interesting that he particularly focused on that as one of the things that we need to look at as the media.
And what's fascinating, of course, is that the most successful cities in the world, London, New York, Hong Kong, you name it, they've been built on the diversity of the populations. And so it should be something that we should embrace if we want to move forward economically. But anyway, that's another discussion. We're going to have to take another quick break. And when we do come back, we'll start taking a look at the front pages of your newspapers and inside as well.
SABC News celebrates Youth Month.
A message from the Association for Alcohol Responsibility and Education. Aware.org.
SABC News celebrates Youth Month.
Right, welcome back. You're watching Media Monitor. It's time now to take a look at what's happening in the Sunday newspapers. And still with me is Kate Skinner and Aliki Saragas. Now, Kate, you had some awards last night, the Sanef Nakasa Awards. And just before the break, you mentioned the Chief Justice, Mogoeng, and he spoke. He was your guest of honor. What did he have to say to a bunch of journalists last night?
Well, it was very interesting because he basically said to us, you know, this award is about courageous journalism, but I don't want you to think that you can sit back on your laurels at all. I think that there's still a huge amount of courageous journalism that we need, and I thought that was very powerful because he put it out there. It was kind of an on-fire speech, which it was really powerful. And the things that he said is that, you know, when we're looking at issues that we need to be courageous about, we need to look at a whole lot of things which we don't look enough at. And so he said, you know, we often look at kind of government and, you know, talk truth to power in terms of government, but not actually at the private sector enough, you know, and other kind of centers of power. And then he talked a lot about colonialism, and then he talked about three different powerful things that we need to unpack: racism, xenophobia, and tribalism. He said those are things that we have got to look at, and if we don't look at them, we are not being courageous and we are not taking this country forward.
My goodness.
And everybody was like, wow,
you know,
yes.
And he's not afraid to speak. You know, we've had a lot of Chief Justices before, and but for somehow this guy seems to be really taking on these social issues.
He does.
But there were winners as well for courageous journalism and other awards. Tell us a little about the winners.
So it was amazing. I mean, I think that the Nat Nakasa judges said they had never had such a fantastic set of nominees. I mean, they were just bowled over by how amazing some of the journalism had been. And then in the end, they basically said it was the Gupta Leaks team. So it was the investigative units, Amabungani, Scorpio, and News 24. And then the final winner was actually Branko Brick, who from the Daily Maverick. And he was the person that actually convened that team because he got the cachet of emails. And then instead of just keeping them emails to himself, he then brought in these various investigative teams. And the other, which is kind of unheard of, that kind of cooperation, and it worked so powerfully. The other thing that he did, which he was commended for, was his protection of sources. And they were saying for those two reasons, your handling of this meant that we got such value, and in fact it changed the politics of the country. And then they talked about his the things that he'd done previously and how brave he was, because various things had collapsed and he got up and he continued. And interestingly, he's Yugoslavian, so talking about people from outside bringing such power, such amazing ideas, and being so innovative and creative. I mean, he just exemplifies all of those things.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful story. But there were other stories in the Sunday papers. Let's take a quick look at those, and let's start with you, Aliki. And I'm not surprised about the story that you picked up. Tell us about what you saw inside the City Press, it looks like.
Yeah, so this is Charles' article today. And I just thought it was very appropriate to be talking about this. It's basically how Modisa Keng was accused of abusing a woman in Kenyan, in Nairobi at the airport, where he, the testimony was that he hit her and then tore up her passport, and he was then detained. She was allowed to go through, and he was detained, and then. Further, what happened is Simpiwe Dana kind of set Twitter ablaze, where she labeled him as an abuser, subsequent to helping him get off the hook in Kenya, which she says her statement was that she didn't know the context of the story before she actually helped him get out. And I think it deals with what we've been discussing today so pointedly, and also the fact that now she's also being kind of held up and labelled.
It is a difficult one, isn't it? And this again always speaks to, before you press the tweet button, before you start saying things, do your homework. Find out as much as you can, because I think there's this jumping on the bandwagon, this groupthink that happens a lot at the moment, and you can end up in a lot of trouble. Definitely, but I also think that we also need these kind of voices. We need abuse to be spoken out. We need to name, we need to name people at the same time, but obviously it has to be done in a way that you yourself, you can also be protected. So I think what's very important is to come to organizations like SWIFT, get advice and feedback before going forward. But I think it's very important that when abuse happens like this with someone who is quite a famous and prolific person in the industry, we need to know about it, and we also need men to call out men. Okay. Kate, what grabbed your attention in the papers?
So some of the kind of political issues about the ANC.
So it's the Sunday Independent and Sunday Times in particular, isn't it?
Yeah, both were talking about the court battles from the fractured and divided ANC. And I think why I was particularly sort of taken by this story is that in our SANEF meeting, we were talking a lot about the elections. What is going to happen in the elections? Are these going to be easy elections? And also kind of interestingly issues about the safety of journalists. What are we going to find? And I think these elections are going to be very fractious. I mean, when you look at the ANC itself and the other political parties, The fact that you've got so many problems in the provinces, and this is about Limpopo, but we've also had Northwest, we've had KZN, and it just means that it's a very complex environment to cover as journalists, but also interestingly, it literally means that when communities are very unhappy, they don't feel heard, they actually sometimes take up those attacks against journalists because they feel so unheard.
And we had some vans burnt this time last year with the hashtag Fees Must Fall campaign. Yeah. Dark web, that was another one that was...
Dark web was very interesting, and I mean, again, I think it kind of piqued my interest because there's been all these data leaks, and suddenly there's a sense of like, oh wow, information that we thought was secure, which is information about finances, all those kind of things, being exposed. And I think also just the other issues which are all linked to the web, which we've been talking a lot about. I mean, all the social media issues. It's this whole new terrain that we are dealing with as journalists, and as citizens. And I think that we feel like a little bit at sea about how to take things forward. And we were all having a very interesting discussion before this about what do you do about abuse, lies, fake news, all of those kind of things which happen on the web. Like, what is the strategy forward? And so when I saw this article, I was like, it's, these are all the things that are kind of coming up.
I'm so nervous to just switch on my computer nowadays. I mean, even just switching on the light, I get nervous. Anyway, we're going to turn our attention away from print to digital. Let's take a look at what's been trending on social media this week, and this package has been prepared for us by our SABC Digital News team.
Starting off with politics, the African National Congress has announced Job Mokgoro as the Premier-elect for the Northwest Province. The position has been vacant for almost a month following Supra Mahumapelo's resignation. The 70-year-old Mokgoro will be sworn in as Premier in the provincial legislature on Friday. The 20th of June marked World Refugee Day. On this day, the United Nations called on the international community to commemorate the strength, courage and perseverance of millions of refugees. This year, World Refugee Day also marked a key moment for the public to show support for the families forced to flee from their homes and home countries. South Africa marked the 42nd commemoration of the June 16 Soweto uprising. With over 3.3 million young people unemployed, government has identified the creation of jobs for youth as one of its key priorities. Meanwhile, EFF leader Julius Malema has launched a tirade against South Africans of Indian descent, claiming that many of them are racist. Malema was addressing a Youth Day event in Klerksdorp in the Northwest. To racial spates circulating on social media, there has been a general condemnation of Kalula.com flight passenger Alokna Moodley, who admitted to using the K-word in a text to reportedly describe the captain and two other passengers. The Ahmed Kathadra Foundation wants action to be taken against Moodley. Model and media personality Sashi Naidu says she's not worried about losing jobs. This after comments she made on social media about the unrest between Israel and Palestine.
Guys, the apology I made today on Instagram was very sincere, I assure you of that. But I've already received 10 death threats today and a lot of backlash. I am sincerely sorry.
Naidu says she's disappointed in herself for not knowing what was happening in Gaza. Ashwin Williams's legal team has confirmed that they will be taking the Supersport matter to the Equality Court, just more than a month after he walked out of studio while live on air. He accused his fellow rugby analysts Nick Mallett and Nas Botha of patronising him. The incident sparked a racial debate at the time after Willemse suggested that Botha and Mallett were undermining him. Supersport released their findings of an independent review that found that there had not been racism. To the courts, Arrive Alive has welcomed the Randburg Magistrate Court ruling, sentencing Preshelin Naidu to 10 years in prison. Naidu was found guilty of culpable homicide in connection with the 2015 car crash that led to the deaths of top-billing presenter Simba Mihira and his friend Katie Shea O'Brien. Minutes before the accident, Naidu had been travelling at 210 kilometers an hour. That's it for your social media wrap. For SABC News in Auckland Park, I'm Nina Westhuizen.
All right, I do want us to talk a little bit about propaganda and this mad website. But just before that, anything that's grabbed your attention in what's been trending this week, Aliki?
Yeah, I find it very interesting this week how kind of racism and that topic has really come out and reared its ugly head again. But also tweets and how when you're held, you have to be held accountable for what you put out there. Xmas A.
What's it? Naidu girl.
Yes. Yeah. So her tweet, calling Palestine, word I can't use on air, is really, I mean, it's horrifying, because I think when you are someone who has such a following, be it on social media or whatever, when you are a leader in your particular field, I think you have to be held accountable and responsible for what you are putting out there. And I think that obviously no one wants her to be receiving death threats and all of that. I think that is obviously she was sorry for what she had done, but I think when you are in such a position, you need to be careful about what you say.
All right, you know what, we're running out of time. I wish we could have spoken a bit more about it, but there is this other story. The owners of a controversial website at the center of disseminating right-wing propaganda on social media have been unearthed as South African expats living in Thailand nogal. The father and son pair of Karel, 54, and Johan Vreemlink, 25, are the administrators of South Africa Today, an aggregator website that republishes negative articles by the Freedom Front Plus and AfriForum, Front National, and other local and international websites and organizations promoting white victimhood in South Africa. The Freedom Front Plus, I must say, denied any relationship with South Africa Today. AfriForum said that they have no relationship or understanding with this website as well, whilst the Front National did not comment at the time of publication. All right, so Kate, let me start with you. These websites are out there. The moment we created www, we were sort of subject to this. How do we live in a world where people can sit in Bangkok and rubbish South Africa?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is happening more and more, and it was interesting because of the timing of this website. So there was a whole lot of issues around land expropriation without compensation, and apparently that's when this kind of website was then really picked up, particularly by social media, so by Facebook and by Twitter, and then there was sort of talking about again crime, farm murders, and then of course issues around land. So I mean, they are incredibly problematic because they do get a huge amount of coverage because they tweeted and retweeted, and they kind of give this perception that there are far more farm murders than there are. I mean, it's terrible that farm murders happen, but the fact is that you can't exaggerate that issue. So how do you deal with it? I mean, I think the thing which is quite important is to expose these kinds of things. And so, I mean, it's really tricky, but I mean, it is around kind of media education. So, for instance, it was a very suspicious kind of site because who's writing this material? I mean, there are no bylines. If you contact the site, there's nobody that you can actually speak to. And so it is, I think, over time, beginning to educate people around, which sites to go to, which ones would be dodgy, because there's certain features of dodgy sites. And I know that, for instance, Media Monitoring Africa is doing all sorts of interesting stuff around, actually highlighting, particular sites, dodgy sites and things. So I think we do need to be vigilant around those things. And I think as a media, which is the kind of established media, we should be talking about the fact, actually these are problematic. These sites, are verified, proper professional journalists, a context, etc.
Okay. And Liki, as a filmmaker, documentaries in particular, you have to use the web to get information. How do you wade your way through what's valid, what's not? Because you end up making films and they have to be accurate.
Completely. I mean, it's vital. I think as consumers in general, as documentary filmmakers and consumers of media, we need to be responsible in how we read media and how we read all these various different articles that come up, and you have to cross-check your facts always. You have to also be talking to people face to face and not just relying on print or social media or web articles. And I really think that as consumers we need to also take responsibility, as much as the media needs to be able to point us into the direction of, well, this is fake news and these are reliable sources. We need to also take responsibility for how we read and be a bit more cognizant of what we're putting into our
okay, ladies, these things go so quickly, faster than Concorde sometimes. Kate Skinner, Executive Director, South African National Editors Forum, South Africa, SANEF, thanks very much for joining us. And Aliki Saragas, Sisters working in film and television, keep up the good fight. Thanks very much for joining us. And that, folks, is Media Monitor for this week. Join us again next week at the same time, when we'll have more for you. Have a great week in between. Bye-bye.